Guanzi Haupa Hano Wekjepanishi. Hello, how are you? Those that have entered here. Thank you very much to Mr. Roshi, the director of the Herd Museum. And thank you all for coming here to be a part of the community. Because it's the community which matters, I think, most of all. And community always includes us as people, as members of society and culture, so that our life may always continue in the way that we want it to continue. I want to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Debbie Reese, who is a member of the Nambé Pueblo in New Mexico, northern New Mexico, and tell you a few things about her, and then she will take over. As I said, Ms. Reese, or Dr. Reese, is from Nambé Pueblo. Therefore, she is a member of the Tewa people. She is a scholar, critic, writer, publisher, author of the critically acclaimed blog, American Indians in Children's Literature, or AICL. Dr. Reese started the AICL blog in 2006 with the teachers of her elders and Native scholars in mind. When she was a professor in the American Indian Studies program at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, Dr. Reese says, "Those teachings are ones that tell us that the work we do is not for ourselves, but for our communities and their well-being." For Debbie, that meant making her research and writing easily and readily accessible to those who typically have the least access to the work of academics. Dr. Reese earned a teaching degree from the University of New Mexico and taught elementary school in Albuquerque, New Mexico, before moving to Oklahoma to work on a master's degree in school administration. Later, while completing her doctorate in education at the University of Illinois in the early 1990s, Dr. Reese worked alongside Native students and allies to establish a Native American house at the University of Illinois. And soon after that, she helped launch an American Indian Studies program at the University of Illinois. So today, Dr. Debbie Reese writes for publications such as Horn Book Magazine, School Library Journal, and Language Arts. She is regularly invited to give lectures and workshops around the U.S., and she has recently begun using technology to work with libraries and colleagues in Canada and elsewhere. So with that, these few words, let's please welcome Debbie Reese, educator, writer, advocate, activist, friend, and sister. Please welcome Debbie Reese.
Well, thanks for coming out tonight. I hope that the things that I have to share with you will be things that you can carry forward with you as you step out of this room and take some action, because I'm all about taking action and doing good things with the things that we learn. My presentation is called Some Truths, but Lots of Lies, Indigenous Peoples and Children's Literature. The lots of lies part is directly related to what I heard from a fifth grader a few years ago, who said to her teacher, who then told me that, you mean all those smiling Indian coloring sheets we had to do in kindergarten and first grade and second grade and third grade? Those were lies? Because it wasn't until that point in her education that she learned that she was being miseducated by the books that she was reading, by the assignments that she was doing in elementary school, and she felt betrayed. This was a child in Ohio, not a native child, but a child in Ohio who felt betrayed by what her teachers were giving to her. And we can't do that. We should not do that to children. So that's where the lots of lies comes from. There's lots of lies in children's books, and I'm about helping people recognize them as problems that we need to do something about. So thank you for joining us here tonight. I have to put thank you in there because I do get fired up about what I'm saying and I might forget to say thank you. So it's on my slide so I don't forget. That's my little sister's grandchild. Her name is Ellie. She has a Pueblo Indian name as well, but I'm just going to tell you Ellie. And she obviously is full of life and full of joy, loves the things that she does with her grandma, my little sister. I want her to look like that. I want that joy every day. Then tomorrow, 5 years from now. But I know that she will not always carry that joy with her because she's going to run into some of these books that have lies in them. And they as a family will have to make some decisions about what they're going to do about those books. So I'm here tonight at the invitation of Simon Ortiz, who I've known for a long time, and I'm going to talk about him a little bit more in the presentation. But this is the Indigenous Land, Culture, and Communities series, which is something very dear to me as well. Part of what I read on the website about the series is that it's about the things that we can do, including to speak and act on behalf of ourselves as a human, social, and cultural world. We are required to speak and act on behalf of land, culture, and community. That's what I try to do. And I do it in the tradition of a long history of Pueblo people speaking and acting. This is a statue of Pope. He is a leader from Taos Pueblo from the 1600s who led the Pueblo people in a revolt against the Spanish, who were at that time oppressing Pueblo Indian peoples in New Mexico. So we have a long tradition of speaking up, taking action, pushing back on oppression. So he is one of my leaders, as is Simon. You're going to see more about Simon in a few minutes. So again, it's about community. So here's Ellie, who I've already introduced you to. And that young man there is my husband when he was in third grade. He's white, he's from Pennsylvania, and we met while teaching at Santa Fe Indian School in Santa Fe. We were both teachers there. Fell in love, of course, and we were married and had a child. That's our little girl. The first time that she danced at home, her name is Elizabeth. So we have here the community, or a small piece of the community that I'm a part of. Ellie, George, and Elizabeth. Moving now to children's books. A scholar named Rudine Sims Bishop in 1990 at Ohio State put forth an idea that books function as mirrors, windows, and doors. With a mirror, you can see some part of your existence reflected in the book itself. So using part of that metaphor, one of my colleagues in children's literature, Sarah Park Dolan, who teaches in Minneapolis, used the idea of the mirror and some data that was generated by the Cooperative Children's Book Center at the University of Wisconsin-Madison to create this graphic. Infographics are very helpful for making complex information readily accessible. So what we see in this infographic is data from 2015. What happens at the center in Wisconsin is publishers send books there. And at the center, the staff sorts them. They determine if a book is primarily about African Americans, Native Americans, Latinos, Asian Pacifics, or if it's a primarily white story, a white character. They've also started counting animals. So you have main characters who are animals, or trucks and pencils and carrots, because children's writing does have quite a range of what a character can be. So this is the graphic they came up with this year. It was released a few weeks ago. And if you study that, you can see that on the far right, we see 73.3% of the books that they cataloged in 2015 were featuring white families, white children. Those are the books that reflect my husband and his experience as a white child growing up in the United States. If you look at the child in the graphic, he's got lots of mirrors, because so many of the books that are being published in 2015 look like white children. If you look over on the far left, there's Ellie, and the child on the far left represents an American Indian child. And of the books that they categorized, only 0.9% were ones that function as mirrors for a child like Ellie. But all that CCBC does is count. This data doesn't actually say anything at all about the quality of the books that they are counting. So that's part of what I do. I read the books and study them and bring to them everything I know as a former professor in American Indian Studies, as a woman born and raised on the reservation. So I bring a lived experience and a studied background, an academic background, to the work that I'm doing in children's literature. So in 2013, going back a couple of years to the data that they had in 2013, CCBC received 3,200 books. Every year, that's about the average of what is published in children's literature. Of that 3,200, they identified 34 that were by or about Indigenous people. Now, as a scholar, as an academic trying to understand trends over time, I limit the sample of the books that they had. I selected US publishers, because a lot of what they get is from Canada. So I limited to US publishers and fiction. And of that 34, 11 books were ones that could be a mirror for Ellie. But the quality of those 11 is a very important question. So I read them. 5 of the 11 were not okay. All 5 of those are from Big 5 publishers. Now, the Big 5 publishers are ones like Simon & Schuster, Macmillan, and Penguin Random House. The Big 5 are the ones with the money. The Big 5 are the ones that can market the books, sending multiple copies to book reviewing sources and journals, to bloggers, to libraries, and the massive distribution that they have, it's massive, it's extensive. So the Big 5 gave us the books in that year that were all problematic, but they're in libraries because they're from major publishers and they're taught in schools. So it's likely that Ellie's going to see those books. I'm going to show you those books. Ghost Hawk, and then this Treasure Chest book is second. Salt by Helen Frost is third. Written in Stone by Roseanne Perry, and Beau at Ballard Creek by Kirkpatrick. 5 historical fiction books, which, as you know, historical fiction are stories that are set in the past. As I read those books, I identified other characteristics about them individually and as a whole. Lots of stereotypes. Stories in them that were presented as though they were traditional Native stories, when in fact they were the creation of the white writer who wrote the book. Factual errors in terms of geography and history. Stories where there was a white savior, a white child or a white character, adults in some cases, saving Native characters from their own foolishness. Also, the last bullet I have there is celebration of exploitation of resources. So the Beau at Ballard Creek at the top right is a gold dust or a gold rush story in Alaska. So this is what Ellie would have if her librarian or her school teacher was using these books from major publishers that came out in that year. That's a problem, because those are distorted mirrors. They're not nice mirrors that reflect her. They are mirrors that distort what Native children see in the books. These are the other 6 books that were okay. Now, what's interesting about these 6 is that they're from small publishers. Small publishers that don't have the money to market the books in the same way that the Big Five does. Less money at their disposal, and so getting these books out into schools depends heavily on word of mouth. We have to talk about them. We have to share them with others. Characteristics about these books include that they're all by Native writers. The 5 from the Big Five, none of them were by Native writers. These 6 books are by Native writers. There's huge measures of authenticity in them. Most of them are writing from their own personal tribal experience. And there's a range of genre. The 5 from the Big Five were all historical fiction. One of these, on the bottom right, Killer of Enemies, is set in the future. Creator's Game is in the present. How I Became a Ghost is historical fiction. If I Ever Get Out of Here is modern fiction. So there's a range of what children can get from the books that are written by Native writers. In 2008, a researcher named Stephanie Freiberg did some research on the impact of image on children who are Native and children who are not. Her article was called "Of Warrior Chiefs and Indian Princesses." If you just do a Google search on that much of that title using her name, you will find a copy of it online. And you can download it. And I want you to do that because I want you to study it, because the data that's presented there is very important. What she did essentially was show a negative depiction, Chief Wahoo, and a positive depiction, Pocahontas. So the people that were in her study had these images to look at. And she did some pre-testing and post-testing of their self-esteem. Before they saw these images, they felt pretty good. But then after they saw these images, their self-esteem decreased, even though Pocahontas is seen by many people to be positive. She's not a derogatory stereotype. She's a romantic or a positive one. But they still did not feel well about themselves. Their self-esteem still went down. And as these researchers, as this team of researchers talked about what's going on here with the children and how they're responding to this test that they were given at her lab at Stanford, what they arrived at was that the kids are not seeing images of themselves as people of the present day. And these kinds of things, they're just not there. So her research is very important. Considering her research and the CCBC data that we just walked through, that the major publishers are giving us historical fiction, what does that mean for a child like Ellie? And what does this mean for you? People here tonight. What does this mean for you? What can you do with this? What should you do with this information? Now, you're here because you care. There is something about the title of the talk, or maybe about the lecture series overall, that brought you here tonight. So you're here because you care in some way. So what I want you to do is to speak and act on behalf of land, culture, and community. What we opened the evening with. Speaking and acting so that children like Ellie have something better. Now here at the top again is that slide of the 5 books that I started with. And I'm going to point out that red X that I have laid over the top of those books. Brain research tells us that the image goes right to your brain. Words can follow, but there's a delay. So the first thing that gets to your brain is an image. So I want you to know that these books have a teacher or an educator's red X on them because they're a problem. When you go to Barnes & Noble, when you see Ghost Talk, I want that red X to be in your brain. So it's not one that you're going to pick up. In fact, I would like you to pick up that book or a book like that and be a little bit activist with it. Take it to the front desk, maybe buy the book and walk away from the desk a little bit. This is activism kinds of things, making waves. And read a little bit from the book as you stand there in the store, and then take it back and say, you know what, I want my money back. This book has racist depictions. This book has derogatory depictions. This book has factual errors about Native people. So I want my money back. Now what will happen in those kinds of situations is the clerk is going to think you're a Looney Tunes. But she will not forget that you pointed out that book to her. And if she doesn't think you're Looney Tunes, then she will think, wow, I should pay more attention to what is in the books that we have in the store. And she may, in fact, take that information to other people that she interacts with. So speaking up in a way like that is also a way that you can affect change in what is being offered to children. On the bottom half of this slide, I have classic and best-selling books. Little House on the Prairie has many, many problems with the way that Native peoples are presented in that and the way that history is presented in that. In the center is The Girl Who Loved Wild Horses by Paul Goebel, and it won one of the most powerful awards in children's literature when it came out. And Paul Goebel has many books. Most bookstores carry more books by Paul Goebel than by Native writers combined. He's a very well-recognized person who writes children's books about Native Americans that we should not be buying because they misrepresent and distort Native story in ways that are doing an injustice to the people who are being misrepresented in those books. On the far right is Brother Eagle, Sister Sky, a best-selling book. When it came out, it continues to hold a fair market share because it's take care of the environment story. An important message. We do, in fact, need to take care of the environment, but we don't need to do it in the way that it's done here, where she essentially, I think, throws Native people under the bus. To her, Susan Jeffers, who brought this book out, this is supposed to be the speech of Chief Seattle, who was of a West Coast tribe, but the illustrations throughout the book are Plains tribes. They're not West Coast. So she's misrepresenting a key person in Native history and his nation. That is not okay. And so I have the red X across those books because they are also problems for children. This is my website, a page from the top half of my website, American Indians in Children's Literature. And I have a green arrow pointing to one of the tabs. If you go to my website and hit that tab, you're going to get a list of best books. That's quite extensive because I have been doing this for 10 years, the blog for 10 years, but studying children's books with Native representations for almost 30 years. So I've got a lot of depth and in terms of what I'm able to look for and provide. So the lists are there. So go and read them because I am talking a lot tonight about problematic books because what I honestly want to do is go to bookstores and just shove all those problematic books off the shelf, and then we'll have an empty shelf, and we need to put better books on that shelf. And the better books that need to go on that shelf are the ones like the 6 by Native writers that I was showing you earlier in the evening. That's what we need to have so that Native children are doing better in school. So what to look for? Say you're walking into a bookstore. What are you going to look for if you're going to pick up a book about Native Americans to give to a kid? I want you to look for a Native author, a Native illustrator. The reason I want you to do that is because when you hand that book to a child, you can say, I forgot my prop, hang on. You can say, this book, The People Shall Continue, is by a Native writer. His name is Simon Ortiz. And when you say his name is Simon Ortiz, you're bringing that writer and that story out of that long ago, distant past into the present day. So that children are learning a very powerful message by that small 2-letter word, is. So on this list, second from the bottom, is verb tense. It really matters. It can do a lot of work that we need to have done for children, Native and not, in the literature that we provide to them. So Native authors and illustrators, ones that are tribally specific. By that I mean that name the tribe that's being talked about in the story. Books that are respectful of Indigenous knowledge. I'd like you to look for the word nation in a book. I want to see an honesty in the story or information being given to the reader. Honesty as we were a long time ago and honesty as we are today. We need the span of time. We are here today. So many children's books and textbooks leave us in the distant past. We never made it to the present day. And of course we did. And so of course we should have materials that reflect that. A children's book author named Tim Tingle, who is Choctaw, talks about touring and visiting schools in Texas, where the kids and the teachers tell him, actually, we're supposed to learn that you're extinct. Now that's tough for Tim, but Tim's like my age. He can handle that. But think of the Choctaw children that are in those schools being taught that they are extinct. We can't let that sort of thing continue. So honesty in terms of the fact that we are still here. And of course, I mentioned verb tense and books that tell the truth. They have to have truths in them about our history. The indigenous peoples of the country, of the United States, we tell our children the truths that we experienced historically. We don't hold that from them. We don't keep that from them. Too much of what we see in children's books right now is that white writers creating stories about Native people don't want to touch those histories because they think that's too hard for kids. We live those truths. All kids should know those stories. The idea of protecting children from hard truths is not one that's centered in a Native way or a Latino way or an African American way of being in the world right now, today. So truths are very important. So here I'm going to start back again with Simon's book. Simon's book, Simon, your book is front and center today. I'm going to do a lot with it. It came out in 1977. The People Shall Continue, and thinking about the criteria that I was talking about, there we have a Native writer, Simon Ortiz. A present tense verb right there in the title, The People Shall Continue. Here's the first page of the book and the way that it opens. Many, many years ago, all things came to be. Many white writers would write that sentence like this. Many, many moons ago. Using what they believe to be a poetic way of writing, a Native voice, but Native people don't write like that. So it's important that you, as people who are going to be selecting children's books, read Native writers so you know how Native writers talk. So this is the first page of Simon's book. Many, many years ago, all things came to be. It's a creation story. It's about how the various nations in the United States tell their creation stories. Some say that people were born from the ocean, from a hollow log, from an opening in the ground. So there's a range, there's a diversity, because we are very different as individual nations that span the United States. Our creation stories are important to us. This is Beaver Steals Fire. It's a Salish coyote story written by the Salish tribe, by the Salish nation. They brought that book forward. It's their own telling of this story, Beaver Steals Fire. The first page of the book has information about when the book should be taught. So it's got educational information in it along with the story itself. Now, what is interesting about that is that it was cataloged as folklore. See, I have that red arrow pointing to the cataloging information for the book. Salish Indians, folklore. Now, if you go to the public library and look to the folklore section, you're going to find fairy tales and folk tales. You won't find Christian traditional stories from the Bible there, because here's Noah's Ark, for example. You will find on the folktale shelf, you'll find Native stories. But religious stories from the Bible, from the Christian Bible, are shelved in a different part of the library. They're not considered folklore. They have a different status. They are literature. They are pictorial works. And they are placed in most libraries on the religious stories shelf. That's a problem. Our stories are over there with the folk and fairy tales. Both people's stories have the same sacred character and should be treated in the same way, with the reverence that any people's sacred stories should be presented in something as a bookshelf at a library. So pay attention to that. When you're in a library, ask the librarian, how come they have this book over here rather than over there? One of the things that I say when I'm talking to librarians that makes them laugh is, how about we just move all the religious stories over to the folk and fairy tales section? Do away with that religious stories section. So anyway, have the conversation with librarians. Going back to Simon's book, he has the word nations early on in the book. Soon the people saw the destruction of their nations as Europeans came over. Obviously, I'm not going to read all of the book. But soon the people saw the destruction of their nations. So I want to see the word nations in there, because too many people think of Native people and they think we dance, we tell stories. They don't think of us as peoples with governments and structured, ordered societies that we were and have been since before the Europeans came to this continent. So the word nations being associated with us is a very important piece of information. In fact, it's at the core. Without that, then we become, quote unquote, people of color. And there's nothing wrong with being people of color, but people of color don't have sovereign nation status that we as Native peoples have. That's important information. Here's another page from Simon's book. When the people saw these men, these Europeans, did not respect them and the land, they said, we must fight to protect ourselves and the land. So that's what I'm doing tonight. I'm fighting in the same way that the leaders of the past fought. And I'm bringing that fight to you and asking you to join with me in doing that fight. This is a Creek writer, Muskogee Creek writer, Cynthia Lytic Smith. This is her picture book, Jingle Dancer. It's about a little girl who is going to do the jingle dance at a powwow for the first time. And the things that are important for you to know about that, this is a picture book. So it's for young children. It is set in the present day. If you open the page and open the cover and start reading that book, the little girl that's in the story could be walking down the streets of Phoenix. It's not in the foothills or somewhere far away, long ago and far away. It's a present day story. The kind of thing that the researchers, Stephanie Freiberg and her associates, determined that Native children need to see, books set in the present day. So here we have that very kind of book. So that's a picture of Cynthia. That's the cover of her book, and the author's note in her book says at the very top, in this story, Jenna is a member of the Muskogee Creek Nation. So there we have nationhood in the author's note. Teachers, parents, librarians who are going to use this particular book with children can read that author's note and bring that information forward. As I said with Simon's book, they can say Cynthia Lytic Smith is Muskogee Creek, bringing her from the distant past into the present day. They can even say, let's see if the Muskogee Creeks have a website. Of course they do. And you can pull up the website. One of the other misconceptions about Native people is that we don't use technology, and of course we do. These are the kinds of things that float around in the subconscious of people in the United States in ways that are quite surprising. Back when the National Museum of the American Indian opened, I was part of our tribal delegation there, and the front pages of the Washington, D.C. papers at the time, they were just fascinated with Native people in traditional clothing on cell phones. As if, like, they use cell phones, and of course. But we need to be very explicit and very careful in bringing that information forward so that people don't think we're primitive people who don't use the technologies that everyone else is using today. So that's Cynthia's book, one that I promote quite a lot. Later in Simon's book, he talks about, so his book starts with the creation stories and it moves through history. At this point in the book, he's talking about the government agents who gathered the children. They took the children to boarding school. So that's part of our history. That's part of the stories that Native children in my community know, because we had grandparents and great-grandparents that went to the boarding schools. There's a range of experience at the schools. Some were good, some were bad. But the point is, that's some of the story we pass on to our children. We want to see that passed on to children through children's books. So here we have I Am Not a Number by a First Nations writer, Jenny K. Dupuy. It just came out, and it's her grandmother's story. It's about her grandmother being taken from her home in a First Nations reserve in Canada and going to boarding school. When they came back from the boarding school and they told their dad what was going on at the school, the dad figured out a way that he was going to keep them home. He wasn't going to let the agent take them back when he came back a few months later. So I Am Not a Number is a story that is handed down in Jenny's family. It's something she knows, and now she's passing that along in the form of a book to other children. And it's doing quite well in Canada. It's with Canada's attention to the boarding schools through the Truth and Reconciliation Project. Jenny's book is like perfectly timed. And so it's on the bestseller lists in Canada. Another page from Simon's book. They were moved by the government into the cities across America. So this movement to the cities is in the 50s, more recent times. But we know there were movements that were happening, removals that were happening historically. We all know about the Trail of Tears, of course. That's one of the most known removals. And there's lots of children's books about the Trail of Tears. Most of them are not written by Native people. This is Tim Tingle's book, How I Became a Ghost, and it's a Choctaw story of being on the Trail of Tears. These are stories from his own family's experience. So that authenticity that I was talking about earlier, something to look for, is through and through these stories, these books that I'm showing you that are by Native writers. All across America, the nations of the people were talking. We're back to Simon's book. The Cheyennes in the cities and the Navajos in the country, Seminoles in Los Angeles, Cherokees in Oklahoma, Chippewa in Red Lake, and the Sioux in Denver. Everywhere. The people on the reservations, in small towns, in large cities, they were talking. They were listening. The people looked around them and they saw black people, Chicano people, Asian people, many white people, and others who were kept poor by American wealth and power. The people saw that these people who were not rich and powerful shared a common life with them. It's important. It's this sense of community that is being built now, today, up in Standing Rock, in the opposition to the pipeline that's being contested up there. This is a photograph taken recently of at one of the camps up there. Black Lives Matter has been up there. Native people from around the country and Native people from other continents, from Australia, from New Zealand, are also making the journey to be at Standing Rock to help fight what's going on up there at Standing Rock. And again, returning to Simon's book, because I think it lays this history out for us, this history that we know as Native people from the past, long ago to the present. We're all people of this land. At the top, I have that circle. And we're all people who should be taking care of each other. At the bottom, with the humanity and the strength which comes from our shared responsibility for this life, the people shall continue. That's the end of Simon's book. The people shall continue. I think the people shall continue as a map for what we need in children's and young adult literature. It lays out the kinds of things that I think we need to see. Nationhood, resistance, truths, hard truths like boarding schools. It's all there. And we're trying to get that back into print. Right now, Simon's book is out of print, and we're trying to bring it back into print. Some of the ideas that are in that book are being brought forward also by other children's books, and I want to show you some of those good things now. This is Julie Flett's book. Julie Flett is Cree Métis writer in Canada and has many books. This one is called Wild Berries. You can't read Wild Berries because it's not written there in English. You can get a copy of Wild Berries in English. But in Canada, the Canadian government subsidizes small presses, so they have more money to try and do things like this. So we have a book by Julie Flett with her language and the symbolic way of writing her language in the book. That's beautiful. It brings language forward in a way that any reader can look at and appreciate and understand. Here's a page from inside. The story is about a grandmother and her grandson picking berries. This is one page when Clarence is little. So it starts out when he's a little baby and he has to ride on her back. When Clarence was little, his grandma carried him on her back through the woods to the clearing to pick wild berries. And then the word wild berries in Cree is there. And grandma carried a basket and sang. So that's a page from in there, and Clarence is going to get a little bit older as you turn the pages, and there's Cree language throughout. Wonderful story that I'd like to see more people bringing into classrooms. Here's two more of Cynthia Lytick Smith, the Muskogee writer who did Jingle Dancer. Two more of her books. Indian Shoes. If you look at the cover of Indian Shoes and look at the background, that's Chicago. Indian Shoes is a set of short stories written for children who are in 3rd, 4th, 5th grade, just starting out to read on their own. And this is a family that's in Chicago because of the relocation programs of the 50s. So many of the major cities in the U.S. have major populations of large populations of Native people. This is one of them. Chicago is one of them, and Cynthia's stories are set there. On the right is her young adult novel, Rain Is Not My Indian Name. A lot that I can say about that book as well, but one of the things that I want to point to is that it has a Black Indian character in it. That is an important piece of who we are as Native communities, that we do have Black Indians amongst our communities, and we need to have those stories part of the stories that we give to children as well. Hungry Johnny. This is a terrific picture book by Cheryl Minema, who is Ojibwe, and Wesley Ballinger, who is also Ojibwe. Now, this is a book many of us who are part of Native communities know all about. In this case, Hungry Johnny has come home, and there's a plate full of cinnamon rolls sitting there on the counter, and man, does he want those cinnamon rolls. But they're not for him to eat because they're going to a gathering. And on the right, when they get to the gathering, he knows he wants to eat those cinnamon rolls, but he can't because an elder has to pray and pray and pray and pray. And he has to wait. Terrific story about that. So I'd like to see more books like that because obviously Johnny is wearing blue jeans. This is not a long ago, far away story. This is a present day story as well. Many of you here probably read Louise Erdrich's books. She writes many gorgeous books for adults, but she also writes for children. This is her 3 of the books in her Birch Bark House series that is set at the same general time that Little House on the Prairie is set. In Little House on the Prairie, Laura Ingalls Wilder made the native people out to be primitive, devil-like people, savage, and demonized the native people that her family, the Ingalls family, was coming into contact with. Louise Erdrich does not do that in this book. She does bring those truths forward, but it's possible to bring those truths forward in writing for children without making someone be a despicable or deplorable character. So these are 3 of her books, and I highly encourage you to get those as well. This is Eric Gansworth's book. This is also a young adult novel. Obviously, you can tell with the headphones on the silhouette of the head, there's a lot of music in this book. The title is If I Ever Get Out of Here. Every chapter in this book is based on a Beatles or a Queen song. So Eric's very cleverly used his love of music in the creation of this story about a child who is making friends with a native child who's making friends with a white child. And in the process of this, the white family is going to take him to Canada to a Queen concert. And as they get to the border, you have to cross the border, so you need your passports. And Louis, the character in the story, gets out his little construction paper identification card that the tribe was issuing in the 60s. And the father of the white child says, "What is this?" "It's my ID. Son, you won't be able to get across the border with this. I'll do what I can to vouch for you, but if they have any questions about who you are, my hands are." And Louis says, "Don't worry, sir. I do this all the time. We member nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy have a treaty with the U.S. and Canadian governments. Canada isn't a foreign country to us. It's part of our territory, so we can cross into it with just our ID cards." So lots of good education being brought forth by Eric Gansworth in this story that is being read by children across the country today, and has just recently been released into paperback as well. So I highly recommend Eric's book. Super Indian, because we like to read comics as well. We do have many writers who are native that are creating comic books and graphic novels. Aragon Star is one. She is Kickapoo, and this is Super Indian. If you haven't yet looked at this, some of you have, I think, you definitely need to pick it up. Super Indian has powers because of commodity cheese. Those of you who are part of Native communities know how valuable commodity cheese is. So it's a great story, and I like that a lot. The humor on page after page after page is terrific. She takes on Stephanie Meyer's Twilight as well. There's a lot of poking fun of the characters in Twilight. Lots of fun. This is In the Footsteps of Crazy Horse. It came out last year. It is a Lakota grandfather and his son going on a road trip. The Lakota boy has come home from school. He's kind of bummed out because his friends are teasing him because he has light brown hair and blue eyes. He has within his family, I think it's his father who is not Native. We have many families across Native nations today who are like that. My daughter's like that. Her daddy is white. So he gets teased by the other kids on the reservation, and his grandpa says, "Come on," takes him on a road trip and teaches him about Crazy Horse, who had light brown hair as well. So In the Footsteps of Crazy Horse is a terrific mirror for Lakota children, especially children, any Native children who don't have the dark hair and dark skin that some of us do have. What's interesting about In the Footsteps of Crazy Horse is that it's written by Joseph Marshall. Joseph Marshall took copies of that book up to Standing Rock because he is Lakota, and they have a school up there, and so they are collecting and gathering books, and his book is up there. I think that is a very cool thing to know, that in this place of resistance in North Dakota, they have a school, and they're reading books by Native writers at that school. So please, what I want you to do is speak and act on behalf of land, culture, and community. Use your knowledge, the knowledge you brought into this room or the knowledge you have gained tonight. Use your knowledge and use social media. Those of you who follow international news, that social media has made a difference in various countries around the world in terms of resistance to oppressive governments. Here in the US, we're seeing tremendous impact of social media. In particular, I'm thinking about Twitter and Facebook in terms of children's literature. In the last year, two things have happened that have never happened before in children's books. Two books were withdrawn by their publisher. A Birthday Cake for George Washington is about George Washington's slave making a cake for George Washington on his birthday. And the story is happy, smiling slaves making a cake for George Washington. African American parents were not happy with that book when they learned about it, and they started talking about it on social media. Eventually, Scholastic, who published the book, couldn't resist that pushback anymore, and they withdrew the book. That's never happened before. The other one is on the right, When We Was Fierce, is also a story about African Americans written by someone who's not African American and who created what she thought was the way that African American teens in the inner cities speak to each other. African American parents who read that thought no, and started speaking about that on social media. And that book was also withdrawn. It was not released. These are important decisions by publishing houses because they invest a lot of money in these books, in the creation of them, in the editing of them, in the printing, getting all the colors and the inks right. The designers, lots of time and money goes into the creation of a book. So to have these books pulled from publication right at the launch of these books is an important thing for us to know. We should bring that kind of voice and resistance and pushback to more children's books. The scuttlebutt within publishing, there's a lot of fear. Publishers are worried that people like you, people like me, are going to read their book and object to a line in the book or object to the whole book. Here's two more books. Both of these books had low man on the totem pole in them. That's the way that it was used in there was to convey social status of one of the characters in the book. Like, you're not important, you're a low man on the totem pole, which is a misrepresentation of totem poles and what their significance is to the people who make them. So that is one of the things that I talk about when I'm working with writers and editors, is that particular phrase. There are others, off the reservation is another one. There are many phrases like that that are commonly used in our speaking as people of this country, that are problematic when you step back and think about, what does that actually mean? Should we be using it in that particular way? So low man on the totem pole has problems in the way it's being used. When I saw it in Out of Darkness, I wrote to the writer and said, Ashley, did you know you used low man on the totem pole? And she did not realize that because it's so commonly used. She didn't recognize that she had used it. But she looked and she found it. And I asked her, so when your book is going to get reprinted, can you take it out? And she said, oh, okay, I will, but I doubt my book's going to get reprinted. It's actually a very good story that went on to win some awards. And so it did go into a second printing. And she did have that line taken out of it. And she talked about that. So this is one of the authors out there who is saying, you know what, I messed up and I made a change in what I had done. And so she's talking about that when she works with other writers, when she works with librarians and teachers, passing on that information. The book on the right, As I Descended by Robin Talley, also had that phrase in it. I didn't write to Robin, someone else did, and it is also on being much discussed in young adult circles, that Robin was told that she should not use that phrase and she pulled it out. Another one is Spirit Animal. That one is also being taken out of a popular young adult novel. So speaking up makes a difference. I want us all to do that a lot, together, alone, wherever you go. This is a baby born this week at the Standing Rock camp. So they have a school and children are being born there. To me, that matters. The resistance is there. The speaking back is there. I want us all to do that because the people shall continue with your help. So thank you.